A man worth over $50 billion sits down for a meal he's had 1,000 times. Alexander Sterling, a titan of industry, expects perfection, precision, and privacy. But tonight he gets none of it. His waitress, a young woman who seems utterly insignificant, does something impossibly brave or impossibly foolish. As she clears his plate, she slips a folded note into his hand. It's not a phone number. It's not a plea for money. It's a ghost. A forward message from a past he buried 2 decades ago. A message that will unravel his entire empire and force him to confront the man he once was. What was written on that tiny piece of paper that could bring the world's most powerful man to his knees? Stay with us to find out. The Gilded Bull was less a restaurant and more a monument to calculated excess. Located on the 54th floor of a skyscraper in Manhattan's financial district, its floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of the sprawling city lights, a glittering, silent kingdom. For its patrons, this was not just a view. It was a reflection of their own status, their dominion over the chaotic world below. The air inside was thick with the scent of aged leather, expensive cologne, and the primal aroma of seared prime beef. Conversations were conducted in hushed, confident tones, the clinking of heavy silverware against porcelain, the only sharp sound punctuating the opulent quiet. Tonight, like most Tuesday nights, Alexander Sterling occupied his usual booth. It was the most secluded table in the establishment, tucked into a corner alcove that offered maximum privacy while still commanding a panoramic view of the restaurant and the city beyond. At 52, Alexander had a face that seemed carved from granite, all sharp angles and imposing lines, softened only slightly by a network of fine wrinkles around his piercing gray eyes. His hair, once a dark chestnut, was now a distinguished silver at the temples, meticulously styled. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that probably cost more than the annual salary of the young man refilling his water glass. He didn't look at the menu. He never did. His order was a standing one, communicated with a curt nod to the maitre d', Robert, a man who had perfected the art of being both invisible and indispensable. A 12-ounce, dry-aged New York strip, cooked precisely medium rare, with a side of asparagus spears, blanched and lightly grilled. A single glass of Chateau Margaux, 1982. The order was a ritual, a small bastion of predictability in a life defined by high-stakes volatility. It was control, distilled onto a plate. Alexander Sterling was the architect of Sterling Dynamics, a global tech conglomerate that had its tentacles in everything from predictive data analytics to autonomous drone logistics. He hadn't inherited his wealth. He had forged it in the crucible of ruthless innovation and even more ruthless business practices. He was a visionary to the public, a predator to his rivals, and a ghost to the few family members he had left. His life was a fortress of his own design, its walls built of money, power, and an unbreachable emotional distance. The Gilded Bull was just one of its many well-appointed rooms. As he sipped his wine, his gaze swept across the room with the practiced disinterest of a king surveying his court. He saw a hedge fund manager celebrating a hostile takeover, a tech rival trying to poach one of his lead engineers, a third-generation real estate mogul dining with a woman half his age. He knew them all, not as people, but as assets, threats, or variables in the complex equation of his world. He registered their presence, calculated their motives, and dismissed them. It was then that he noticed his waitress for the evening. She was new. He was certain of it. He had an eidetic memory for faces, a useful tool in his line of work, and he had never seen hers before. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with tired but intelligent eyes the color of moss. Her brown hair was pulled back in a severe, functional bun, though a few errant strands had escaped to frame a face that was pale and carried the subtle tension of someone perpetually worried. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her steps light but deliberate, her posture straight despite the obvious fatigue that clung to her like a second skin. He watched her as she took the order from the table next to his, her voice low and professional. There was nothing remarkable about her. She was just one of the countless anonymous faces that serviced the machinery of his life. The drivers, the pilots, the chefs, the security guards, the servers. They were functional, necessary, and utterly interchangeable. He had already forgotten her when she approached his table, his steak balanced expertly on a tray. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice clear and steady, betraying no sign of the intimidation that usually afflicted new staff in his presence. "Your New York strip, cooked medium rare." She placed the plate before him with practiced grace. The steak was perfect, a deep, caramelized crust giving way to a warm, ruby-red center. The asparagus spears were arranged with geometric precision. It was exactly as he expected. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, his eyes already on the quarterly report displayed on his phone. He didn't see her hesitate for a fraction of a second, her hand hovering near the table. He picked up his knife and fork, the heavy silver cool and familiar in his hands. He was about to make the first cut when she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "Will there be anything else, sir?" He glanced up, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. The transaction was supposed to be over. He was meant to eat, and she was meant to disappear until it was time to clear the table. He gave a single dismissive shake of his head and looked back down at his phone. He heard her retreat, the soft sound of her rubber-soled shoes fading on the plush carpet. For the next 20 minutes, Alexander ate in silence, his attention divided between his meal and the fluctuating stock market data on his screen. The steak was, as always, flawless. The wine was a symphony of dark fruit and earthy tannins. The city lights twinkled like a carpet of fallen stars. Everything was in its place. Everything was under control. It was a perfect, sterile, and utterly lonely existence. But it was the only one he knew. He placed his knife and fork together on the finished plate, signaling he was done. A moment later, the new waitress reappeared. She moved with the same quiet efficiency as before, her expression unreadable. "I hope you enjoyed your meal, Mr. Sterling," she said, her tone perfectly neutral. As she reached for the plate, her movements were fluid, professional. But this time he was watching. He saw her other hand, the one not holding the plate, move with lightning speed. It was a tiny, almost invisible motion. Her fingers brushed against his own, which were resting on the table. He felt the brief, cool touch of her skin and the crisp, folded corner of a small piece of paper being pressed into his palm. It was so quick, so discreet, that anyone watching would have missed it. His first instinct was one of pure, unadulterated rage. The audacity. Was this a journalist? Corporate espionage? A clumsy attempt at seduction from someone who vastly overestimated her own appeal? His security detail, seated discreetly at the bar, would have her identified, investigated, and blacklisted from every service job in the city before he even signed the bill. He curled his fingers around the note, his knuckles white, his gray eyes cold as a winter storm, lifted from the table and locked onto hers. He expected to see fear, or perhaps a smug, triumphant grin. He saw neither. Her moss-green eyes met his directly, and in their depths he saw a maelstrom of emotions he couldn't immediately decipher. Grief, defiance, and a profound, bone-deep sorrow. It was the look of someone who had nothing left to lose. She held his gaze for a single, charged second, then turned and walked away, his empty plate in her hand. Alexander Sterling, a man who could move markets with a single word and topple corporations with a phone call, sat frozen in his booth. The entire world, the glittering city, the hushed restaurant, the hum of his own immense power, all of it faded into the background. There was only the small, square piece of paper warming in his clenched fist. With a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly, he brought it up and, shielded by the tablecloth, slowly unfolded it. It wasn't a phone number. It wasn't a threat. It was a receipt, the cheap, thin paper used by the restaurant's order system. Scrawled on the back in neat block handwriting were just 4 simple words. 4 words that bypassed every defense he had ever built, that smashed through the walls of his fortress and struck him squarely in the ghost of a heart he thought had died long ago. The note read, "The Nightingale Protocol lives." Amelia Vance felt the tremor in her hands long before she approached his table. It started as a faint quiver in her fingertips and radiated up her arms, a humming current of pure, unadulterated terror. She gripped the heavy silver tray until her knuckles turned the color of bone, focusing on the simple physics of her task. Walk, balance, serve, retreat. For the past 2 months, this had been her singular focus. Getting this job, being assigned to this section, waiting for this specific Tuesday. Every action had been a calculated step toward this one terrifying moment. Her life was a world away from the opulent theater of the Gilded Bull. It was a cramped, third-floor walk-up apartment in Queens where the scent of her mother's medicinal herbs mingled with the constant dampness from a leaky radiator. It was juggling a full-course load at law school during the day, her mind saturated with torts and contract law, and then racing to the subway to put on her starched uniform and serve $1,000 dinners to men who wouldn't notice if she spontaneously combusted. Her reality was a mountain of debt, a stack of her mother's ever-growing medical bills, and a gnawing, inherited grief that had shaped her entire existence. Her mother, Catherine, was the reason for all of this. A gentle, once vibrant woman, she was now frail, her body waging a slow, losing war against a degenerative neurological disease. The treatments were experimental, astronomically expensive, and offered only a sliver of hope. A sliver Amelia clung to with the fierce desperation of a drowning woman reaching for a piece of driftwood. And the man in the corner booth, Alexander Sterling, was the architect of her family's ruin. He was not just a name in a newspaper or a face on a magazine cover to her. He was the villain in the story her father had told her, not with anger, but with a quiet, devastating sadness that had eventually consumed him. Her father, David Vance, had been a brilliant software engineer, a man who saw beauty in lines of code and dreamed of changing the world. Alexander Sterling had been his best friend, his business partner, his brother in all but blood. Together in a cluttered garage that always smelled of soldering fumes and stale coffee, they had created the seed of what would become Sterling Dynamics. David was the genius, the innovator. Alexander was the salesman, the strategist, the one with the killer instinct. Amelia had grown up on stories of their early days, of all-night coding sessions fueled by cheap pizza, of sketching out algorithms on napkins that would one day be worth billions. And she had grown up with the story of the betrayal, the legal maneuvering, the stolen intellectual property, the final brutal ousting that had left her father with nothing but a pittance and a non-compete clause that had effectively ended his career. David Vance, the man who had laid the golden egg, had been cast aside while Alexander Sterling built an empire upon it. The stress and the humiliation had broken her father. He drifted from one menial job to another, a ghost of his former self, until a heart attack took him at 45. He left behind a grieving wife and a 10-year-old daughter armed with a brilliant mind and a heart full of secondhand sorrow. For years, Alexander Sterling had been an abstract monster to Amelia. But as her mother's condition worsened and the bills piled up, the monster became a target. Revenge was a luxury she couldn't afford. Justice was what she craved. She'd spent a year researching him, learning his habits, his routines. She discovered his weekly pilgrimage to the Gilded Bull, a creature of absolute habit. It was her only way in, her only chance to get close enough to bypass the army of lawyers and assistants that insulated him from the real world. Getting the job had been the easy part. Her intelligence and composure impressed the manager. The hard part was the waiting. For 2 months, she'd worked the less desirable sections of the restaurant, watching him from afar, her stomach a knot of anxiety. She studied him, the way he never smiled, the way his eyes were always scanning, assessing, the way he treated the staff with a cold, dismissive indifference that was almost worse than outright cruelty. He wasn't a person, he was a force, and she was about to stand in his path. Tonight, her section manager had called in sick, and by a stroke of luck, she was assigned the corner booths. Her heart had hammered against her ribs when she saw the reservation list. A. Sterling, table 32. Now, as she stood by the service station, her heart was a frantic drum against the silence of the restaurant. She watched him finish his meal. She had the note, a folded receipt, tucked into the sleeve of her uniform. The words were burned into her mind. The Nightingale Protocol lives. It wasn't a random phrase. It was a key. It was the name her father had given to the core algorithm they had designed, the very heart of Sterling Dynamics' initial success. But it was more than that. It was personal. Her father had named it that because when Amelia was a baby, the only thing that would stop her from crying was his clumsy, off-key rendition of the lullaby. "Hush, little baby." He'd called her his little nightingale. Alexander Sterling was the only other person on earth who knew that story. It was a message from the grave, delivered by the ghost's daughter. It was designed to prove who she was and to shatter his composure. Her hands trembled as she picked up her tray. "Breathe, Amelia. Just breathe. You are your father's daughter. You are not afraid of him." It was a lie, of course. She was terrified, but she was also fueled by a righteous anger that had been simmering for over a decade. She approached the table, her footsteps silent on the carpet. "I hope you enjoyed your meal, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice a marvel of control. She didn't know how she managed to sound so calm. Her mind raced as she reached for the plate. Now! It has to be now. Her movements, which she had rehearsed 1,000 times in her mind, became automatic. Her left hand secured the plate. Her right hand, holding the note, darted out. A brush of skin, a whisper of paper. The transfer was made. She felt the jolt as her fingers touched his, as if she had touched a live wire. She pulled back instantly, her mission accomplished. And then she made herself look up and meet his eyes. The initial flash of annoyance in his gaze was quickly replaced by a cold, dangerous fury. It was the look of a predator whose territory had been invaded. Amelia felt a primal urge to flee, to run from the restaurant and never look back. But she held her ground. She thought of her mother, of the tubes and machines, of the faint, hopeful smile she managed on good days. She thought of her father, of the light that had gone out of his eyes long before he died. She let him see the truth in her own eyes. The grief, the defiance. She was not a threat to his company. She was a threat to his conscience. She held his gaze for one more heartbeat, a silent declaration of war, then turned and walked away, the heavy plate in her hand feeling as light as a feather. She didn't look back. She could feel his stare burning into her, a physical weight. She deposited the plate in the kitchen, her body moving on autopilot. Her colleagues bustled around her, oblivious to the monumental event that had just transpired. Back in the relative anonymity of the service station, she leaned against a wall, finally allowing the tremors to shake her whole body. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She had done it. She had delivered the message. She had knocked on the door of the fortress. Now all she could do was wait and see if the man inside would answer, or if he would simply send his soldiers to destroy her. The world did not stop. The diners at the adjacent tables continued their hushed conversations. The servers continued their silent, balletic movements. The city outside continued to glitter with indifferent beauty. But for Alexander Sterling, the universe had contracted to the 4-inch square of cheap paper in his hand. Time had not just slowed, it had fractured. His mind, a finely tuned machine that processed terabytes of data, that ran 1,000 possible scenarios for every business deal, that anticipated market shifts with preternatural accuracy, had simply stopped. It was like a powerful computer unplugged from its source. The rage he had felt a moment ago evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping dread that started in the pit of his stomach and spread through his veins like ice water. The Nightingale Protocol lives. It was a ghost whisper in a dead language, a code word from a buried life. The name hadn't crossed his mind in 22 years. He had intentionally, methodically, and successfully purged it from his memory, burying it under 2 decades of wealth, power, and willful amnesia. He had built an empire on its foundations while raising the memory of its architect. His hand, the hand that signed checks for billions of dollars, trembled as he stared at the words. The handwriting was neat, precise, feminine. It wasn't David's frantic scrawl. David was dead. He had confirmed it himself years ago, a brief, sterile obituary found through a private investigator. A heart attack. Age 45. Case closed. A loose end tied up. But this note, this was not a loose end. This was a resurrection. His mind, rebooting with a painful jolt, was suddenly flooded with an image he hadn't summoned in a lifetime. A garage in Palo Alto, circa 2003. The air thick with the smell of ozone and instant ramen, fluorescent lights humming overhead, and David Vance, his face illuminated by the glow of a CRT monitor, his eyes blazing with a feverish, ecstatic light. He was hunched over a keyboard, his fingers flying, a mess of dark hair falling into his eyes. "I've got it, Alex. I finally got it," David had shouted, his voice cracking with exhaustion and triumph. It's, it's elegant. It learns. It anticipates user needs before the user even knows them. It's not just an algorithm. It's practically sentient. Alexander had looked over his shoulder at the cascading lines of code, understanding only a fraction of its genius, but all of its potential. "What do you call it?" David had leaned back, a rare, wide grin splitting his face. He looked utterly spent and happier than Alexander had ever seen him. "My wife, Catherine, she's been calling me every hour, telling me little Amelia won't stop crying. The only thing that works is when I sing her that stupid lullaby. Hush, little baby. I call her my little nightingale." He'd pointed a trembling finger at the screen. "So this is for her. We're calling it the Nightingale Protocol." The memory was so vivid, so visceral, that Alexander could almost feel the stale air of the garage in his lungs. He remembered the shared dream, the unshakable belief that they were on the verge of changing the world together. He also remembered the cold, clear calculation that had formed in his own mind in that exact moment. He is the genius. I am the vessel. The world only remembers the vessel. Now the genius's ghost was sitting at his table. He lifted his head, his gaze sweeping the restaurant, searching. He found her. The waitress, Amelia. Little Amelia. It couldn't be. He saw her standing near the service station, her back to him, her shoulders tense. The tired, pale young woman was suddenly cast in a new, terrifying light. He replayed their brief interaction in his mind, searching for clues he had missed. Her eyes. They were David's eyes. That same intelligent, soulful green, but hers were shadowed with a grief he now understood all too well. The pieces clicked into place with the sickening finality of a cell door slamming shut. This wasn't a corporate spy. This wasn't blackmail from a stranger. This was a reckoning. David Vance's daughter had found him. A wave of nausea rolled over him. He, who had faced down hostile boardrooms, government regulators, and Wall Street predators without flinching, was undone by a waitress with her father's eyes. The note wasn't just a message. It was an accusation. It told him that his past was not dead. It told him that the foundations of his gilded cage were built on a tomb, and the ghost of the man he had buried was now knocking from within. He had to get out. The opulent room, usually a source of comfort and control, suddenly felt suffocating. The air was too thick, the lights too bright, the muted conversations a grating roar in his ears. He fumbled for his wallet, his usually steady hands feeling clumsy and foreign. He threw several $100 bills onto the table, far more than the cost of the meal, a reflexive gesture of a man used to solving problems by throwing money at them. As he stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, several heads turned in his direction. Robert, the maitre d', materialized at his side, his face a mask of professional concern. "Is everything all right, Mr. Sterling?" Alexander couldn't speak. He felt as if the name on the note was branded on his forehead. He gave a curt, jerky nod and strode towards the exit, his long legs eating up the distance. He didn't look at Amelia again. He couldn't. To look at her would be to acknowledge the truth he had spent a lifetime denying. He was a thief. He had not built an empire. He had stolen one. His security detail, two large men in dark suits, fell into step behind him, their expressions impassive but their eyes alert, sensing the sudden, inexplicable shift in their client's demeanor. They followed him into the private elevator, the polished brass doors closing with a soft hiss, sealing him inside a small, mirrored box. Staring at his own reflection, he saw not the powerful titan of industry, but a pale, haunted man with fear in his eyes. The fortress had been breached. The ghost was inside the walls, and Alexander Sterling had no idea what she wanted, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she was going to make him pay for his sins. The note was just the opening salvo in a war he thought he had already won 2 decades ago. The past is never truly buried. It just lies dormant, waiting for a tremor to bring it to the surface. For Alexander Sterling, the 4 words on a slip of paper were an earthquake. As his chauffeured Maybach glided silently through the rain-slicked streets of New York, the city lights blurring into abstract streaks of neon and gold. His mind was unwillingly dragged back 2 decades to a world of cheap computers, boundless ambition, and a friendship he had systematically dismantled. Palo Alto, 2002. It wasn't a gleaming campus of glass and the steel then, but a chaotic ecosystem of dreamers operating out of garages and rented office spaces. Alexander and David Vance were two such dreamers. They had met at Stanford, two brilliant minds from opposite ends of the social spectrum. Alexander was the polished, ambitious business student, the son of a moderately successful but emotionally distant surgeon. He saw the world as a series of systems to be mastered and leveraged. David was the introverted, prodigiously gifted computer science major, a scholarship kid from Ohio who saw code as poetry and technology as a tool for human connection. They were an odd pair, but they complemented each other perfectly. David was the engine, the source of the revolutionary ideas. Alexander was the chassis and the driver, the one who could package those ideas, sell them to venture capitalists, and navigate the treacherous roads of the business world. Their friendship was forged in the fires of all-night study sessions and a shared ravenous hunger to make their mark on the world. After graduation, they pooled their meager savings, rented a dingy garage, and founded Nexus Innovations, a name Alexander had chosen for its corporate-sounding gravitas. Their goal was audacious: to create a predictive analytics engine that could anticipate human behavior on a scale never before imagined. While other companies were focused on organizing existing data, David wanted to predict future data. Their life was a blur of caffeine, code, and conviction. Alexander handled the business plans, the pitches, the endless networking. He schmoozed and charmed, promising venture capitalists the moon, while David was back in the garage, actually building the rocket ship. David worked with a singular, obsessive focus. He would go for days without proper sleep, his desk littered with empty energy drink cans and complex diagrams sketched on whiteboards. His wife, Catherine, a kind, patient art history student, would often bring them sandwiches and gently remind David to come home. It was during this period that Alexander saw the first glimmers of what would become the Nightingale Protocol. It was David's magnum opus. He explained it to Alexander, not in technical jargon, but with a philosopher's passion. "Imagine, Alex," he'd said, his eyes alight, "a system that doesn't just respond to a user's query, but understands their intent. It learns their patterns, their desires, their needs. It could revolutionize everything from advertising to medicine to urban planning. It could help people connect with what they need before they even know they need it." Alexander saw something else. He saw profit. He saw power. He saw a path to the life he had always craved, a life of unassailable success and influence. And a cold, pragmatic thought began to take root in his mind. David was the soul of the company, but in the cutthroat world of Silicon Valley, souls were a liability. The first betrayal was small, a venture capital meeting with the prestigious firm Blackwood & Cross. David was supposed to co-present, to explain the technical genius behind their work. The night before, Alexander told him the meeting had been rescheduled. It hadn't. Alexander went alone. He pitched Nexus Innovations as his brainchild, framing David as a brilliant but volatile lead engineer who was best kept behind the scenes. He was more persuasive, more polished on his own. He secured their first round of funding, $5 million. When he told David, he framed it as a strategic victory. "They just want the business guy, Davey. You know how these suits are. They get scared by the technical stuff. This is better for us. You focus on the product. I'll handle the sharks." David, ever trusting and pathologically non-confrontational, accepted the explanation. He was just happy they had the funding to continue their work. He didn't see the subtle shift in the company's legal structure that Alexander's new lawyers had drafted. The paperwork that named Alexander the majority shareholder and CEO, while classifying David as a co-founder with a minority stake and the title of Chief Technology Officer. The final betrayal was a masterpiece of corporate cruelty. By 2004, the Nightingale Protocol was functional, a thing of terrifying beauty and power. They were on the verge of launching a beta product that would undoubtedly attract massive acquisition offers. They were celebrating at a cheap dive bar, drinking beers and dreaming of their inevitable success. To Nexus, David had toasted, his face flushed with rare, unreserved joy. To changing the world. To Nexus, Alexander had echoed, clinking his bottle against David's, the lie tasting like ashes in his mouth. 2 days later, Alexander called an emergency board meeting. The board now consisted of himself and 2 venture capitalists from Blackwood and Cross, whom he had spent months winning over. David was not invited. Citing a clause in David's employment contract about proprietary ideation, Alexander argued that since the Nightingale Protocol was developed using company resources, the $5 million he had secured, it was the exclusive intellectual property of Nexus Innovations. He then made his move. He proposed a corporate restructuring. They would dissolve Nexus Innovations and immediately reform it as a new entity, Sterling Dynamics. The new company would acquire all of Nexus's assets, namely the Nightingale Protocol. As CEO and majority shareholder, Alexander would lead the new venture. David Vance, he argued, was a brilliant but unstable element, a garage tinkerer not suited for the global stage. He offered to buy out David's minority stake for a sum that was generous for a failed startup, but insultingly minuscule compared to the protocol's true worth, $500,000. The offer was contingent on David signing an ironclad non-disclosure agreement and a 5-year non-compete clause. The board, loyal to the man who had made them promises of astronomical returns, agreed unanimously. Alexander delivered the news to David in the same garage where their dream was born. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He laid it out with the cold, dispassionate logic of a surgeon explaining a necessary amputation. David had stared at him, his face a canvas of confusion, then dawning horror, and finally utter heartbreak. But we built this together, Alex. It was our dream. It's just business, David, Alexander had said, the words feeling hollow even to him. This is how the game is played. You're a genius, but you're not a killer. You need a killer to win. You were my friend, David whispered, the words barely audible. You were my brother. Friendship doesn't get you a seat at the table, Alexander replied, sliding the severance papers across a workbench. This does. David never fought it. He was a creator, not a fighter. The labyrinthine legal battle required to challenge Alexander would have destroyed him. He took the check, signed the papers, and walked out of the garage, leaving his life's work behind. Alexander watched him go, feeling a fleeting pang of something that might have been guilt, but he quickly smothered it with the intoxicating thrill of absolute victory. He never saw David Vance again. He heard whispers over the years that David had tried to start other projects but was hamstrung by the non-compete, that he had moved away from California, that he was working a low-level IT job somewhere in the Midwest. Alexander had his investigators keep a discreet file on him just to ensure he was never a threat. When he received the news of David's fatal heart attack in 2017, his primary emotion was not sadness, but a cold, final sense of relief. The last loose end was gone. The story was his to tell, with David relegated to a footnote as an early contributor. Now sitting in the back of his Maybach, the story had come back to haunt him. The waitress Amelia, with her father's eyes, was not just a ghost. She was a witness, a living testament to the lie his entire life was built upon. The Nightingale Protocol was not just code, it was a legacy, and he had stolen it from a dying man's daughter. The tremor he'd felt in the restaurant wasn't fear of exposure. It was the long-delayed shock of a conscience he thought he had successfully murdered 20 years ago. Alexander Sterling did not sleep. The image of Amelia Vance's face and the 4 words on the note were seared onto the back of his eyelids. His sprawling penthouse apartment, usually a sanctuary of quiet control, felt like a prison. The panoramic views of the city seemed to mock him, a glittering empire built on a foundation of sand. For the first time in his adult life, he felt a loss of control, a terrifying sensation for a man who orchestrated every minute of his existence. He did what he always did when faced with a threat. He gathered information. He bypassed his usual security team, not wanting to create a digital trail. Using a privately encrypted laptop, he delved into the life of Amelia Vance. What he found was a portrait of quiet, desperate struggle. She was a top-tier student at Columbia Law School, on a partial scholarship but still drowning in student loans. Her mother, Catherine Vance, was battling a rare form of multiple sclerosis. The medical bills were staggering. Amelia was working 2 jobs, the waitressing gig at the Gilded Bull and a paralegal assistant position at a small, underfunded legal aid clinic. She was fighting on all fronts and losing. There was no indication of blackmail, no network of conspirators. There was only a daughter armed with the truth trying to save her mother. This was not a corporate shakedown, it was personal. And that made it infinitely more dangerous. By dawn, he knew he couldn't ignore her. He couldn't send lawyers. That would be an admission of guilt, and it would escalate a private reckoning into a public war. He had to meet her, on her terms. He sent the message through Robert, the maitre d' at the restaurant, the only intermediary he could trust to be discreet. The instructions were simple. Tell the waitress from table 32 that Mr. Sterling wishes to speak with her. She is to name the time and place. She will not be followed or recorded. The reply came 2 hours later. A coffee shop in Brooklyn, near her apartment. The Daily Grind. A place so far beneath his notice, it might as well have been on another planet. Tomorrow. 3 p.m. The Daily Grind was everything the Gilded Bull was not. The air smelled of burnt coffee and steamed milk, not aged leather. The furniture was mismatched and worn. The lighting was dim, and the clientele consisted of students hunched over laptops and locals chatting loudly. Alexander, in a tailored cashmere sweater and dark trousers, his attempt at casual, stuck out like a hawk in a sparrow's nest. He chose a small table in the back, his posture rigid, his face an unreadable mask. Amelia arrived exactly at 3 p.m. She wasn't wearing her waitress uniform, but a simple pair of jeans and a faded university sweatshirt. Her hair was down, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. Without the severe bun and the tired pallor from her long shift, she looked even younger, but her eyes held the same weary intelligence. She looked more like her father than he had realized. It was unnerving. She sat down opposite him, placing her worn backpack on the empty chair beside her. She didn't seem intimidated. She seemed resolute. "Thank you for meeting me, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice even. "I believe you wanted to meet me," he countered, his tone clipped and cold. "You have my attention. What is it you want?" He decided to be direct, to treat this like a negotiation. Identify the demand, assess the cost, settle the transaction, move on. Amelia didn't flinch at his tone. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a thin, worn leather journal. She placed it on the table between them. "My father wasn't a businessman. He was a record keeper. He wrote everything down, his ideas, his hopes, his disappointments." Alexander stared at the journal. He recognized David's messy handwriting on the cover. A cold dread, sharper than before, settled over him. "After he was forced out," Amelia continued, her voice gaining a steely edge, "he tried to recreate his work, but the non-compete you made him sign was a legal cage, and he was haunted by what he had lost, what you had taken. But he documented it all. Every line of code for the original Nightingale protocol, every design document, every email exchange between the two of you from the early days." She pushed the journal slightly towards him. "It's all in there. His story, the real story of how Sterling Dynamics was founded." Alexander felt the trap closing. This journal, in the hands of a journalist or a rival company, would be devastating. It wouldn't bankrupt him, but it would shatter the carefully crafted myth of the self-made visionary. It would expose him as a fraud. "What is your price?" he asked, his voice low and tight. "This isn't about a price," she shot back, a flash of her father's idealism in her eyes. "This is about a debt. You built a $50 billion empire on my father's genius, and you left him to die broke and brokenhearted. You owe him, and since he's not here, you owe his family." She slid a single piece of folded paper across the table. It wasn't a note this time. It was a medical bill. He unfolded it. The number was astronomical. The cost for a year of an experimental treatment for her mother's disease. It was a fortune to her, but to him it was a rounding error. "My mother is dying," Amelia said, her voice thick with emotion for the first time. "This treatment is her only chance. It's expensive, and it's not covered by our insurance. The irony is the diagnostic tools they use to monitor her condition, they run on a predictive analytics platform that was derived from your From my father's technology. The blow landed squarely. He had not only stolen David's future, his stolen legacy was now taunting David's dying wife. I don't want your fortune, Amelia said, her composure returning. I don't want a trust fund or a place in your company. I want you to pay this bill. You will set up a fund, managed by the hospital, to cover all of my mother's medical expenses for the rest of her life. That is the price, not for my silence, but for my father's work. Alexander looked from the bill to her face. He saw no greed, no guile. He saw only the fierce, unwavering love of a daughter fighting for her mother. He had expected a blackmailer, a grifter. He was faced with something far more formidable, a person with a righteous cause. His old instincts flared. He could fight this. He could bury her in litigation. He could hire private investigators to dig up dirt on her, discredit her, paint her as an extortionist. The thought was ugly, but it was familiar. It was the path of the predator. And the journal? He asked, his voice dangerously soft. What happens to that? Amelia looked him straight in the eye. The journal is my father's legacy. It's not for sale. Whether I receive your help or not, I will never use it to hurt you publicly, because my father, despite everything you did to him, never taught me to be cruel. He taught me to be fair. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the space between them. I'm offering you a chance to be fair, Mr. Sterling. Perhaps for the first time in your life. She stood up, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. You have my email address. I'll expect to hear from your financial advisor or your lawyers. The choice is yours. With that, she turned and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving Alexander Sterling alone with a medical bill, a ghost journal, and the suffocating weight of a 2-decade-old betrayal. For the first time, the cost of his success was not measured in dollars, but in the quiet, unassailable dignity of the young woman he had just tried and failed to intimidate. The drive back to his penthouse was a blur. Alexander sat in the silent, leather-upholstered cocoon of his Maybach, staring unseeing at the city rushing past. The meeting had not gone as planned. He had expected a negotiation, a battle of wills where he held all the power. Instead, he had been judged. Amelia Vance had not come to him as a supplicant or a threat, but as the arbiter of a moral debt he had long forgotten he owed. He walked into his apartment, the floor-to-ceiling windows displaying a stunning sunset over the Hudson River. The sky was awash in fiery oranges and deep purples. It was a view that had once filled him with a sense of triumph, a visual confirmation of his place at the top of the world. Tonight, it just made him feel small. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the expensive single malt tasting like ash in his mouth. He paced the vast, minimalist living room, the silence amplifying the storm in his mind. The choices before him were clear, each with its own set of consequences. He could unleash his legal team. He had the best corporate lawyers in the world. They could tie Amelia up in court for years, drain her meager resources, and paint her as a delusional extortionist. They could create a narrative that David Vance was a disgruntled early employee who had been compensated fairly. They would win. In the eyes of the law, they would be right. He had the contracts to prove it. But he would know the truth. The victory would be hollow, another brick in the wall of his self-imposed isolation. It would mean destroying the last remnants of the man he had betrayed, this time through his daughter. Or he could pay. He could quietly transfer the funds, make the problem go away. It would be the simplest, most efficient solution, a business transaction. He would sign a check, and in return, he would buy silence and peace of mind. He could go back to his life, back to his routine at the Gilded Bull, and pretend the last 48 hours had never happened. The ghost would be reburied, the past sealed away once more. But as he stared into the amber liquid in his glass, he realized that neither option felt right. The first was monstrous. The second was insufficient. Amelia's words echoed in his head. I'm offering you a chance to be fair. Fairness. It was a concept he hadn't engaged with in decades. In his world, there was no fair. There was only strong and weak, winner and loser, predator and prey. He had always been the predator. But seeing David's journal on that cheap coffee shop table, seeing the reflection of his old friend's earnestness and pain in his daughter's eyes, had stirred something in him. a flicker of the young man he used to be, the one who shared dreams with David in a dusty garage before ambition had curdled his soul. He sat down at his desk and opened the secure file his investigator had sent him years ago. The obituary for David Vance. He read it again. It was short, sterile. David Vance, 45, of Columbus, Ohio, survived by his wife, Catherine, and daughter, Amelia. There was a low-resolution photo, a man with a kind, tired face. He barely recognized him. The vibrant, brilliant friend he remembered was gone, replaced by a stranger worn down by life. Driven by an impulse he didn't understand, he made a call to a man named Michael Corrigan, the best private investigator money could buy. Corrigan was discreet, thorough, and utterly immoral, perfect for the usual tasks Alexander assigned him. This time, the task was different. "Michael," Alexander said, his voice quiet, "I need you to find out everything you can about the last 15 years of a man named David Vance and his family. I don't want dirt. I want the truth. Medical histories, financial struggles, where he worked, where his daughter went to school. Everything. I want a picture of their lives." For the next 2 days, Alexander was a ghost in his own life. He canceled his meetings. He ignored the calls from his board. He sat in his silent apartment as Corrigan's reports trickled in, each one a fresh stab of guilt. The reports painted a bleak picture. David, blocked by the non-compete, had bounced between a series of soul-crushing IT support jobs, his genius confined to fixing printer jams and resetting passwords. They had struggled financially, draining their savings to keep up with the mortgage. Then came Catherine's diagnosis. The financial strain became a catastrophe. David had taken on a second job, working nights as a janitor to try and keep them afloat. The stress, the long hours, the constant worry, it was a direct line to the massive heart attack that had killed him. After his death, Amelia, then just 17, had become the sole provider. She'd worked her way through community college before earning the scholarship to Columbia, all while caring for her increasingly ill mother. The file was a testament to a decade and a half of quiet suffering, all of it a direct consequence of the day Alexander had slid those papers across a workbench. He had not just stolen a company, he had stolen a life. He had stolen a husband from his wife and a father from his daughter. He had pushed them off a cliff and then spent 20 years admiring the view from the top, never once looking down to see the wreckage he had caused. The final report from Corrigan contained a scanned image. It was a page from one of David's later journals, found in a box of his old things. It wasn't code. It was a letter to Amelia, one he had never given her. "My dearest Nightingale," it began, "if you ever read this, I hope you will not think of your father as a failure. I had a dream once, a beautiful one, and for a short time I shared it with a friend. The world can be a hard place for dreamers. Sometimes the dream gets taken away, but they can never take away the love I have for you and your mother. That is the one thing I built that no one can ever steal. Don't let the bitterness of my story become the ink of yours. Be happy, be kind, and never stop singing your song." Alexander stared at the scanned page, his vision blurring. A single hot tear traced a path down his cheek, the first he had shed since he was a child. It felt like a crack appearing in a dam. The grief, the guilt, the shame he had suppressed for 2 decades came flooding through. He finally understood. Simply paying the bill was not enough. It was another transaction, another way of using money to keep the messy, painful parts of humanity at arm's length. It would save Catherine's life, but it wouldn't honor David's. It wouldn't right the monumental wrong he had committed. He picked up his phone, his hand steady now. He didn't call his lawyer. He didn't call his accountant. He typed an email to Amelia Vance. The subject line was simple: a debt to be paid. The body of the message was just 2 words: I surrender. A week later, Amelia sat in the nation's top neurological center. Her mother was in a private suite, her experimental treatment fully funded by an irrevocable trust Alexander Sterling had created. He arrived alone, stripped of his usual arrogance, his face etched with a solemnity she'd never seen. He confessed that simple restitution wasn't enough. He had read her father's journals and was creating the David Vance Foundation for Ethical Innovation, with a $1 billion endowment to protect brilliant minds from predators like him. He then offered Amelia a seat on the board, and eventually the position of executive director, giving her the power to shape her father's new legacy. "Why?" she asked. "I stole his song," Alexander admitted, his voice heavy with 2 decades of guilt. "I can't undo the pain, but I can make sure his song is heard again." Amelia looked at the man who had been her villain and saw for the first time a flicker of true redemption. The anger for her lost father remained, but it was now joined by a complex understanding. "He would have liked that very much," she whispered. A new future was being built from the wreckage of the past. That single folded note did more than demand justice. It sparked a revolution in a man's soul. Alexander Sterling's story reminds us that no wall of wealth or power is impenetrable to the truth. It shows that our past, no matter how deeply we bury it, has a way of finding us, not always to destroy us, but sometimes to offer us a chance at redemption. Amelia Vance, driven by love and armed with her father's legacy, didn't just save her mother. She resurrected a man's conscience. Their journey is a powerful testament to the idea that it's never too late to right a wrong, and that the most profound transactions in life have nothing to do with money. If this story of justice, consequence, and the enduring power of family resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates a story with a powerful message. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that will leave you thinking. Click the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for listening.